Hi everybody, it's Leela from Miss Kiss Creations. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to show you how I created this bee tumbler. I absolutely loved creating this tumbler. I know I'm late to the game, but I wanted to make this personally for myself. The decal shown here will be available on my Etsy shop, so be sure to check out my description for that link. I know that a lot of people like to put BEE kind, so if you do want to do it that way, then go ahead and make your tumbler yours. And like always, all of my materials will be listed in my description below, including some beginner help tutorials. I know this video is going to be long, so if you do want to fast forward through any parts, go ahead and fast forward through those parts to get to the parts that you need help with. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started on this tumbler. I'm starting out with a 20-ounce stainless steel tumbler. I did receive this stainless steel tumbler from Maker Flow Crafts. I went ahead and I sanded this stainless steel tumbler down with a 180 grit sanding block, and then I wiped it down with a 91% alcohol. I then spray painted it with a flat or white spray paint. You can also spray paint this with a brown or tan spray paint if you do have that on hand. And then I went ahead and I applied glitter to this tumbler using the epoxy method. Once I added the glitter, I went ahead and I added another coat of epoxy over this tumbler. So this tumbler is completely epoxied. The reason why I skipped this step of the video is because I will be posting a help tutorial on how you epoxy a tumbler using the epoxy method and the Mod Podge method. And I just wanted to save time for the video. So like I said, this tumbler has been epoxied. It's completely epoxied. I will say I kind of got some thin epoxy up here, and then the bottom I didn't wipe down a lot with that 91% alcohol, so you could see that epoxy is kind of repelling there. This shows that it's very important to wipe this tumbler down with 91% alcohol. I'm just going to work through this. How I'm going to fix this is I'm just going to sand away at the bottom and just make it one smooth bottom. The fact that this is going to be a peekaboo cup, this is not going to affect this, but if I was going to sell this tumbler just glittered like this, I would probably personally just redo the entire tumbler and strip it down. Now let's pretend I didn't mess up the bottom. Let's say that everything's fine. I just need to lightly sand this. I'm going to be going in with a 220 grit sanding block, and I'm going to lightly sand this tumbler. I don't want to sand this with a lower grit sanding block, a very coarse sanding block, and I also don't want to sand this very hard because I don't want to sand away that glitter. Once you start seeing your glitter turn silver, that means that you've sanded too hard, or you've sanded with a lower grit sanding block and you've sanded away your glitter. I'm going to just go in and lightly sand this tumbler. This is just getting rid of any of those little tiny bumps that kind of pops up from that glitter. They're not really obvious bumps, but if I would put a decal on there or spray paint this, you're going to see that through the spray paint, and I want a nice and smooth tumbler. So I'm going to sand this and then I'll return. Throughout sanding my tumbler, I take my hand and I kind of feel the areas that might need more sanding, so you could feel like little bumpy parts, and I just like to go in lightly and sand that area. Now for the bottom, I'm going to be sanding this down using a lower grit sanding block, so I want a more coarse sanding block because I'm really going to be sanding this away. I don't want this tumbler to be upright and then it like wobbles or something, so I will be using like 120 grit or even an 80 grit sanding block for the bottom. Once your tumbler is all sanded, it's going to look like this, very foggy. So I like to go in with my 91% alcohol. I have my little pre-cut squares that I've already cut, and then I just wipe this down with 91% alcohol. This takes away any of that sand that comes off your tumbler, and I always like to do this because whenever I have the alcohol still wet on the tumbler, this basically is how it's going to look under epoxy. So once you've wiped it down with 91% alcohol and the alcohol has dried on the tumbler, it's going to fog up again. Do not worry about that. Once it goes underneath the epoxy, it's going to shine right back up. I'm going to be placing this tumbler to the side, and now I'm going to move on to Cricut Design Space to create my hexagons. Now moving on to my decals I'm going to be creating for the tumbler. I wanted to show y'all this because I feel like this is a very important step of the tumbler, and instead of posting one to sell, I wanted to show y'all how you can do it if you don't want to buy one. So I am using Cricut Design Space. I do have a desktop, not a Mac, and this is very simple. We're going to go to Shapes and go to Hexagon. it's going to put a silhouette hexagon on your screen. And now what you're going to do is either add another one, but I've already resized it, so I'm going to click duplicate, and you're going to see two. If you want to see them better, so what I do is I just always change the color of the top one, and then I just make the top one smaller. So what I do is I kind of put it right in the middle, and I think if you have Mac or iPad, it kind of adjusts to the middle, like auto adjust to the middle. And I want to make sure that these lines are completely even. So you don't want it like this, and you know, it's going to be an outline. It's going to turn out to be an outline like here. So you want the lines to be completely even as you can. If it's not that specific, or you know, if it's not perfect, don't worry about it too much, but this looks perfect or close to perfect to me. So I'm going to grab both of them, or select both of them, and I'm going to go down to the right hand corner, which is right down here on my desktop, and I'm going to choose the option slice. This is going to create 3 images. So you have your 2 that you have started with. I'm going to delete both of the images, and I'm going to be left with this. This is what you want to use, because whenever Cricut Design Space or whichever system that you are using cuts this out, you're going to have 2 images. So you're going to have the image inside, image inside, and then the outline. Now, if you notice that this image outline is thinner than this image, it's because you can make your thickness as thick or as thin as you like. So do this however you like it, whatever makes your crafting heart happy. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to size these around, and I haven't measured, but I'm going to do it about 1 inch, and then probably 1.5 inches to maybe 2 inches. So what I like to do is I don't like to waste any vinyl. If I know I'm going to be doing this tumbler again, I'm going to cover up my entire Cricut Joy mat with these hexagons and have them already cut out. So that way I can use them in the future, and I don't have to keep making more cuts. Okay, so I have cut my hexagons out, and I've already weeded one. So here's the one I haven't weeded. We are keeping both the silhouette and the outline on that vinyl. So I'm only going to be weeding just the outside of the vinyl. And I didn't tell y'all this before, but obviously I am using black vinyl. This is your choice. I know a lot of people like to use the gold vinyl, but I wanted the black outline because I think it's going to really accent those bumblebees when I add them to the tumbler. So you're just going to be weeding like so. And like I said, we're going to be keeping that silhouette inside because we are going to be using that. Now that I have my vinyl weeded, I'm going to be using my craft towel and putting my tumbler on my craft towel so it doesn't roll on my desk. And we're going to be adding the hexagons to the tumbler. So these hexagons are going to be the 2-inch hexagons. These are the 1.5 inch, and these are the 1-inch hexagons. We're going to be taking that middle piece out. So all I do is I just peel that from the backing, and you're going to keep that outline on the paper. So I'm going to be placing this randomly on the tumbler like so. So you can place these hexagons anywhere around the tumbler. I personally like the 1.5 inch and 1-inch hexagons. Probably the 2-inch hexagons are probably a little big for the 20-ounce tumbler. But if you are doing like a 30-ounce tumbler, they might work well for that. So I'm going to be placing these randomly like I said, and trying not to place them right side up. And then I'm going to go in with the smaller ones and then place these on the tumbler as well. Just randomly. And like I always say, place as many as you like. This is your tumbler. If you want a lot of hexagons, place a lot. If you want a little bit, place a little bit. And what I like to do is, let's say I want like a little group of the honeycombs or the hexagons. You'll place like 2 together, and then it creates that cute little group there. So I am going to be adding a cute quote on here, so keep in mind if you are doing the same, keep like a little area open just so you can add that quote. All of my decals have been added to my tumbler. Like I said, I have that little area for my quote. What you're going to be doing next is making sure that these decals are completely pressed down on your tumbler, because the next step is going to be spray painting. So I'm going to go around this tumbler and press down each decal at a time, just to make sure that spray paint doesn't go underneath that decal when you spray paint your tumbler. Now that my decals are pressed on, I'm going to go outside and spray my tumbler with a flat or white spray paint. You can also spray this with any color you like if you want like a light yellow. I just don't have that on hand, so I'm just gonna stick to my white. Keep in mind, if you did not sand your tumbler, then whenever you spray paint, any areas that are going to be bumpy from the glitter is going to peek through that spray paint. So I will let y'all know, I remember I mentioned this in the beginning, that this top has a very little epoxy on here, so this is going to be all bumpy. But the fact that I'm adding a drip to this tumbler, it's not going to affect this at all, because the drip is going to camouflage that and it's going to blend right in with that drip. So I'm going to take this outside, spray paint it. I'm going to let it sit for about 30 to 35 minutes, let it dry. Do keep in mind that my drying times might differ from your drying times, and then I'll see y'all soon. For my next step, I'm going to create kind of an alcohol ink design on my tumbler. I am using a gloved hand for this part. I will be using some yellows and maybe some tans on the tumbler. I'm going to be applying the alcohol ink with some makeup sponges or wedges. And then I have some, I cut up like a sponge I purchased from the Dollar Tree. So if you guys don't have the alcohol or the makeup wedges, then the sponges also work as well. These are the 3 yellows I have on hand, and this one actually says golden yellow, but this is more of an orange. And then I have the Pinata Sunbright yellow, and then I have the Tim Holtz Sunshine yellow. I'm also using caramel and latte from Tim Holtz as well. I'm just going to be placing these colors on the tumbler, and whichever colors I kind of like, those are the ones I'm going to stick with. My drip is going to be this gold color from Arteza mixed with a yellow. And then I'm going to be adding these bumblebees to the tumbler as well. So I'm going to keep these both near me. So whenever I do add the alcohol ink design, I'm going to kind of compare it to make sure that these colors don't clash and make sure that it goes well together. I shouldn't have a problem because there's a lot of yellow, silver, black, and gold, and they should all work well together. I'm going to first start with my sunshine yellow, and what I'm going to do is very simple. I'm sure y'all have seen this effect before. I have it on my other videos. I'm going to be adding the alcohol ink to the tumbler like so, taking the makeup sponge, the wedge, or the sponge that you have from the Dollar Tree, and just blotting it on the tumbler. So I'm first going to be adding just the lighter color right now. I want to add the lighter color before I add any darker colors, just so it's easier to see a darker color over the lighter than the lighter over the darker. And if you've noticed, I'm not really worried about where the alcohol ink goes, so I'm going to be applying it over this decal. We are going to be peeling up the decal later, so don't really worry about designing that area, but if you do get some of the texture or the alcohol ink on there, it's not going to be a problem. And you can see I'm also adding the alcohol ink to the wedge, and then I'm adding it to the tumbler. So whichever way is easier for you, and I like to add it all over the tumbler, and I like to add it until it's basically completely gone off the tumbler, because it gives it different shades and different kind of effects on the tumbler. So you can kind of see it's lighter up here because there's less alcohol ink, and it's darker right here because it was more. So it gives it a cool little effect whenever you run out of the alcohol ink on the wedge. I'm going to try the Pinata Sunbright yellow and see if that's a different color or if it has kind of a different effect. So you can see that is very bright. So I'm going to be adding just a little bit of that for now, but I do want to add different shades of yellow all over this tumbler. I'm going to be using the sponge and see how that works, because I've never used this sponge before. So all it does, it gives it the same effect, but it makes it bigger. So if you do have a coarse sponge on hand, or even one of those natural sponges, that works as well. You can see it makes a cool effect. And I'm going to go in back with my, I should say, darker yellow, and then do that as well. I am using the same sponge for each color. I'm not really worried about that because it's going to blend anyways. These colors are going to overlap, so you don't have to waste that many supplies. So those are the three colors that I'm choosing for this tumbler. As I mentioned, it's going to be the Tim Holtz Sunshine Yellow, Pinata Sunbright Yellow, and Tim Holtz Latte. Now that you guys have the hang of this, I'm going to fast forward through this part of adding all the alcohol ink on the tumbler, and then I will see y'all soon. Alright guys, I have placed all of my alcohol ink on my tumbler, and I don't know if you noticed on the playback, but what I was doing was I wasn't really worrying about where any of the colors were going, and I was overlapping a lot. So you could see, like, here is the latte, and then we have that bright yellow, and then we have that darker yellow. So I try to blend most of them. I also try to cover up the white as much as I could, and even if there was some white peeking through still, it still goes with the effect. Alcohol ink dries fairly quickly, so you don't have to worry about a dry time. My next step is going to be removing these hexagons from the tumbler, and I'm going to be taking my weeding tool and kind of picking them at the bottom without really trying to scrape the tumbler. So a lot of times people do that, so they kind of pick it, and then what happens is they move the pick or the weeding tool too quickly and it scrapes that tumbler. So I'm just carefully picking the edge of one of these hexagons, and I'm trying to just peel it up. I also have my backwards tweezers, as I call them, to kind of peel up that vinyl as well. So this is a very tedious part of the tumbler, but it has to be done, and we have to peel this up. And I'm just doing this one at a time. And then once you're finished with that, I'll let y'all know what the next step is. All of my decals are off of my tumbler, and if you can see, I did put some nicks in some of these areas on the tumbler because of my nails. So you can easily fix that by just adding more of the alcohol ink. Just be very careful on where you're adding this, because we don't want to put this inside of those hexagon or inside of that glitter areas. So I'm just going to be adding the latte, which is the darker color, onto the sponge and kind of just sponging around those areas like so. And you can see it has that nice effect. And if that is a little too dark, then I'll just go in with my lighter yellow and do the same thing and just pat on top of it to kind of even that out. And so that way you don't see the nick inside of that area anymore. The next step is going to be adding those hexagon outlines. I went ahead and I added my transfer tape on the decals, and then I cut them all down. So this part is another optional part. If you want to keep your tumbler like so and you don't want to outline it, then you can leave it like this. It's completely up to you. So all I'm going to be doing is taking that hexagon and putting that hexagon right over that glitter silhouette area. Do be careful with this because we have not sealed this tumbler yet. So these alcohol inks are still pretty fresh. They are dry, but I don't want any peeling of the alcohol inks just yet. But I wanted to add these outlines before I sealed it with any sealer. And it should look something similar to this. And what you can do is you don't have to add every outline to each hexagon. You can do just like maybe 2 here, 1 here, whatever makes your heart happy. So I'm going to finish this part and then we'll move on with that next step. The decals are now on my tumbler and you can see how cute this is. I absolutely love this. I created a decal on my Cricut design space. I will put the font inside of my description below, and I will have this decal on my Etsy page. I did measure the decal. It is going to be about 3 by 3. I measured the space on my tumbler. What I'm doing now is I'm just cutting around the decal and just getting rid of any excess transfer tape, just so I can lay the decal on a little easier. And I'm just going to be placing this decal right in the center of the tumbler. I will be honest with you, I kind of had an idea of maybe putting an offset on here. So if you do want to add an offset to this decal, I think it would look really nice. But I also didn't want to make this tumbler more busy than what it is already going to be. So I'm just placing this on, and like I told y'all before, I have not sealed this. So I'm trying to place this decal on very lightly, but I still want those the decal to actually stick, but I don't want that transfer tape peeling up this alcohol ink. So I find a little bubble on my decal, I stick my weeding tool underneath it, and then my next step is going to be slowly peeling that transfer tape back. And you can see that it did not peel any of that alcohol ink up. Since I'm sticking that decal on this alcohol ink and not epoxy, it is a lot harder to stick that vinyl on the alcohol ink, but I wanted to skip an epoxy step, and I'm trying to do this all in one and just epoxy the tumbler at the end, right? And now my transfer tape has been removed from the tumbler, and you can see how cute that decal looks on this tumbler. My next step for this tumbler is going to be spraying it with a Krylon Crystal Clear Acrylic Coating. I am going to be spraying this tumbler with 2 or 3 generous coats of the acrylic coating. I really want this alcohol ink to be sealed in the tumbler, because whenever I add my epoxy to my tumbler, it might fade the alcohol ink. If you don't have any sealer on hand, you can always just let your tumbler completely air dry for a total of 24 hours. I have let my alcohol ink tumblers sit for 24 hours. When I went to epoxy them after 24 hours, it did not fade the inks at all. And do note, whenever I did do that, I was using Tim Holtz or Pinata brand alcohol inks. I'm going to go outside, spray my tumbler, and let it sit to dry for about 30 minutes, and then I'll see y'all then. Now that my tumbler has been dried with the acrylic sealer and is almost dry, I'm now going to be creating the drip. I am going to be using epoxy for this part, and I will be adding some things to my epoxy to give it color and some shine. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be using this acrylic paint from Arteza. It is gold, and it's kind of like a shimmer of paint, so you'll see whenever that comes out into the epoxy. I'm going to be adding some sunshine yellow to that to make it kind of balance with the tumbler. And then I'm going to be adding this epoxy adhesive from Glitter Heart Co. It is called Majesty. I have my epoxy here. I have mixed a total of 20 milliliters of epoxy. That's 10 milliliters part A and 10 milliliters part B, totaling 20 milliliters of epoxy. I will probably have some left over. If I do, I'd rather have more left over than not enough. So what I'm going to be doing is adding my Nice and Thick to my epoxy from Counterculture. This just lets the epoxy kind of thicken up, and so that way it won't run really heavily, and I also don't have to babysit it. And I'm also going to be adding the other things inside of the epoxy as well. So all I do is I take my popsicle stick and I just add the product into the epoxy, and then I just mix my epoxy like I would. So make sure you do mix your part A and part B evenly before adding it, and then add that Counterculture Nice and Thick. So I just keep adding it I probably add, it's 20 milliliters, so I'll probably add about 3 of these spoonfuls of the nice and thick into the epoxy, and then you'll start seeing the epoxy or feeling the epoxy get thick. So before I add my last spoonful of the nice and thick, I'm going to be adding my other paints and alcohol inks and the epoxy additive into the epoxy. I'm going to be first adding my acrylic paint, and I just added some right into that Dixie cup, and I'm just going to be spinning and stirring the epoxy until it is mixed evenly. And you can see the color is kind of, it's gold, but I want it to be a little yellow, like I said. So I'm going to try to add a little bit of alcohol ink in here and try to make it just a little bit more honey-like and not so much gold-like. So you can see now it's starting to look more like honey. I'm going to add one more drop of alcohol ink, and then I'm going to mix it together, and you can already start to feel that epoxy thicken it up, and that's what I want. I don't want this nice runny epoxy because I want that drip to be controllable. I don't want that drip to drip all the way down and not be able to control that drip. And then I'm going to go in and add my epoxy additive, and I'm just going to kind of tap some in here. This matches that glitter underneath that peekaboo, so it is like a holographic gold. This epoxy additive is literally shimmer, so it is not glitter. It just gives it a nice shimmer shine. You'll be able to see it whenever I put it on the tumbler. I don't know if the camera's picking it up now, but it is not glitter. If you want to add the glitter on here or inside of your epoxy, go ahead and add glitter. Make this tumbler your own. So what I do is I take a little bit of the epoxy, just a little bit like you see, and then I place it along the tumbler. So I'm just smearing it on the tumbler with my wooden stick, and I'm trying to gauge how thick or thin that epoxy is. If it's too thin, then I know to add more of that triple thick into that epoxy. So you can see that this is barely even dripping, and so that's what I want. I want to show you on a different angle. This is barely dripping. So, and I like that color. It almost looks like peanut butter. So you just kind of look and gauge, like I said, how much you have in here. And if I'd always like to make it more thick than more thin, because I like my drips more close to the rim than dripping down the tumbler. And what's really cool about this is, as you can see, I could just let my tumbler sit on its side like this and it's not going to go anywhere. So if your drip is dripping too much, then just put it on its side like I'm doing, or flip it upside down, because I'd rather that drip go towards the opening of the tumbler, so you could just kind of wipe that off, then drip too much down. Because once your epoxy is on your tumbler, it's really hard to get it off. So again, I'm going to do the same thing. I did add a little bit more of that triple thick in my cup. You can see it is so tacky now. So this is actually like honey or peanut butter. And I'm just kind of letting it string on my popsicle stick, and then I'm just going to put it on my tumbler at the very top of it. So just literally smear it on like so, and then it will do its own thing. It will drip the way that it wants to drip. I always focus more on that rim area than I do on the bottom, because I know it's going to drip down. And I'm going to add another coat of epoxy on here because I don't want it transparent. You can see the cup underneath. I want that to be more solid than transparent. So I'm going to finish this part, and when I'm done adding all of the drip on the tumbler, I'm going to turn on the camera and explain my next step. My drip has been added to my tumbler. I used about 10 milliliters of epoxy so far, and my epoxy is super thick right now. So this is probably going to be all that I add. You could see on the sides, I have that nice long drip, and it's dripping down. What I did was I took a heat gun and I just kind of heat up part of this tumbler, and it allowed that drip to drip down more. And you can see how this one's going towards this way because it's not sitting up and down. So that's something that I also wanted to mention, so I'm glad I did that. And then you have some bubbles in here, so I'm going to let it kind of do its thing and drip some more. And then I'm going to also add a little bit of heat again and then pop those bubbles. So what I'm going to do after I'm finished with that is I'm just going to allow my tumbler to air dry or air cure for about 6 hours or so. I'm not going to place this on the cup turner. I'm just going to let it sit because I want those drips to really take over. So I'll see y'all in about 6 hours once my epoxy has dried more. Welcome back, everybody. My epoxy has been sitting for about 7 hours. So you can hear that it is dried. It's not completely cured, but it is dried enough for us to move on to the next step. I'm going to be adding these cute bees that I found on Amazon, and I'm sure a lot of people have already seen these. So you have a couple options for your next step. One, you don't have to add these bees, obviously. If you want, you can add little decals of the bees if you don't want it to be kind of 3D. Second, you can add these bees like I'm going to do now and then epoxy over them, or you can epoxy over your tumbler and then add the bees later. I'm going to be adding the bees with hot glue, so I want to make sure that they stay on the tumbler, so I'm just going to epoxy them over. If I was going to add the bees after the epoxy, I would either use E6000 or UV resin. I use the UV resin from Counterculture as well, and that way you could just put a little bit of UV resin on the tumbler, add the bee, add your light on there, and it'll be dry within 5 minutes. And I'm just going to be placing the hot glue on the bee and just filling up that little hole. So I'd rather have too much hot glue than not enough. And hot glue dries super fast, so we're just going to place that right there. So I want some bees like on the honey, I want it towards the bottom. I'm just going to place maybe 4 or 5 on the tumbler because I don't want to overdo it because there's already a lot of stuff going on with this tumbler. So I don't want to make it too busy, but I still want to make it beesy. So you can see it dries almost instantly. And there's a little bit of hot glue hanging out. I'm just going to let that completely dry. And if I need to, I'll just take my X-Acto knife and kind of cut that area right there. And then I'm just going to add the rest around the tumbler, wherever I feel like adding them. I have added all of my bees to my tumbler, and I went back to using my hot glue gun because this bee got out of control. So let's just say that this bee is a female bee, if you know what I mean. But I try to add some brown alcohol ink. It does stick out like a sore thumb, so I'm gonna try to blend that a little bit more. But once your bees are on your tumbler, we're going to go in and start epoxying our cup. I have mixed my epoxy off screen. I have mixed a total of 40 to about 45 milliliters of epoxy. That's 20 part B and 20 part A, totaling 40 milliliters of epoxy. Just like every tumbler, I'm just going to be placing the epoxy right on the tumbler. So this is not going to be any special way. I'm not focusing on the bees just yet. I'm just trying to place it on the tumbler, and then make sure you are putting it on that drip as well. Now remember what I told y'all, I've only had this drip drying for about 7, maybe 8 hours. So I am putting epoxy over that drip again. It does not need to be completely cured for 24 hours for another part of epoxy or another layer of epoxy to be placed over that epoxy drip. So now what I'm doing is I'm just placing some epoxy over those bees as it spins around, and I'm just trying to cover it with epoxy. So I'm just doing that. I'm not chasing the tumbler. I'm just making sure that there's going to be epoxy all over this tumbler, and those bees are going to be covered with epoxy, or at least sealed in with epoxy. Don't try to get too crazy with epoxy on the bees because you don't want a pool of epoxy just sitting near or on top of those bees. So right now I'm just doing a quick just sweep up the tumbler, and I'm focusing on any areas that may be bare with no epoxy at first, and then I'm going to come back in and focus on each bee. So right now I'm just going to focus on this bee and then just go around the tumbler just to make sure each bee is covered with that epoxy. But like I said, not flooded with that epoxy because we don't want all that extra epoxy just sitting on top of a bee. If you have to turn off your cup turner for this to get the little nooks and crannies of these bees, go ahead and do that, whichever makes it easier for you. If your epoxy does start running down, don't worry about it too much. Once you turn your cup turner back on, it's going to spin right back on that tumbler, and the epoxy is going to smooth and even out. Once I'm finished adding the epoxy to the tumbler, I'm going to let my tumbler spin on the cup turner for about 6 hours. After 6 hours, I'm going to turn off my cup turner, and then I'm going to let my cup turner air dry or air cure for another 18 hours. So I am going to have a total drying or curing time for a total of 24 hours. So my epoxy is basically on the tumbler. It is completely covered. I'm gonna make sure I'm getting the top real quick. I'm gonna let this spin on the cup turner, and I'll see y'all in about 24 hours. My tumbler is completely cured and she is finished. The only thing I have left to do is clean up that inside and the rim. I do have a video on how to clean the inside of your tumbler and the rim, and I will be linking it in my description below. I hope y'all enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed creating it for y'all, and if you did, please be sure to like this video and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more tumbler and craft videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.